I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. It's my pleasure today to be speaking with Domino Renee Perez from the University of Texas in Austin, and Rachel González-Martin, also from the University of Texas. Domino is an associate professor in the Department of English and the Center for Mexican American Studies. Rachel is an assistant professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the university. Their book, Race and Cultural Practice in Popular Culture, interrogates race from a number of perspectives, including cultural studies, folklore, and media industry analyses that question the role of race in popular culture, such as film, television, and music. It's divided into three parts: visualizing race, sounding race, and racialization in place, each of which interrogates racial representations in visual, audio, and geographic sites respectively. It's definitely an important work that puts race at the center of cultural practice and popular culture. It's probably something a lot of people ought to check out if they haven't yet. I'll remind everyone that Rachel and Domino have been kind enough to volunteer 5 books that each of them recommends. And without spoiling all of these books, I will say that each one starts with another's book, which is interesting. I mean, these two are an amazing research team working together. I've never heard people finish each other's sentences like they do. You'll see what I mean in a moment. And so it's just an interesting and really great collegial relationship, it seems. Those recommendations are available at tinapp.org, and while you're there, especially if you're in the holiday giving season, you can buy a coffee for the podcast. And that's a way of supporting the podcast that recently got added to the website. So check it out if you haven't already. That's always very much appreciated. Domino and Rachel, thank you so much for speaking to me today about your book, Race and Cultural Practice in Popular Culture. I think since the three of us will be talking, it's probably helpful if you each introduce yourselves so that listeners can hear who's speaking and what each of you sounds like. And maybe you can start by saying a little bit about how the two of you got started with this book and how you got it off the ground.
So my name is Domino Perez. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English and the Center for Mexican American Studies. And my first monograph was on the Greater Mexican folklore figure La Llorona. And so in that book, I focus on everything from folklore all the way to popular culture, looking at her representations across time and across media. And that work being expansive as it is, I was familiar with dealing with those different types of text, and I enjoyed doing that. And it was something that I wanted to bring to another project. And then that brings us to my co-conspirator.
Yes, my name is Rachel González-Martin. I'm an assistant professor in Mexican American and Latina Studies, and also affiliated with the Center for Mexican American Studies, the Center for Gender and Women's Studies, and whoever else will have me at this point. And I'm a folklorist and an anthropologist by training, and my book, which is coming out in the fall, is about the Quinceañera celebration and looking at it as a cultural tradition, really fundamentally connected to consumer culture and popular culture. But for me, and I think I'm being allowed to start here, is I came to this topic because I actually read Domino's book when I was in graduate school, but I didn't read it in a class. I read it because I was reviewing it for a folklore journal. And basically, I was having a real come to Jesus moment because none of the scholarship that I had been reading in my coursework was really anxious to acknowledge, let alone foreground folklore, the practice of folklore, and the connection to wider mass media popular culture. And so when I found Domino's book in graduate school, extremely helpful, extremely useful, and in many ways was guiding how I wanted to think about my own dissertation work at the time, not knowing that I would eventually end up her colleague at University of Texas, I was super excited to get here and be able to have these conversations, which I always knew made so much sense, the relationship between individual cultural practices or community cultural practices, but also the representation of those practices in sort of wider society, that they absolutely were conversations that were being had in my discipline, and particularly not with the emphasis on race and class. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that when we came together in person, that it was very natural that we would do a project together like this.
So my side of the story is that I didn't know that she had written the review of my book. But at the time that I was the director of the Center for Mexican American Studies, we were putting together a conference, and I was specifically looking for scholars who were doing work not only with Latino communities, but concerning race in the body. And so I came across Rachel's work, and she was a graduate student, and I was so excited by the way in which she was talking about quinceañeras and considering the material aspects of quinceañera and the quinceañera tradition, and looking at it independently of the way that I think it's often or frequently discussed, and that's in terms of the ritual practice, around religion, around coming of age, and the conversations that she was having around quinceañera. The quinceañeras it was just completely new and it was exciting. And so I invited her to come and be a part of the conference that we were having. She tells that story about receiving the email in the cafe with a friend of hers.
And I was like, oh my God, Domino Perez emailed me. And they're like, what's going on? I was like, I don't know. I immediately thought she read the review of the book. She found me. That's what it was. But it was not. Luckily, it was an invitation to come to Texas.
Yes.
To have a conversation in the symposium about dress in the body and fashion and cultural production. And it was fantastic. And then in a year, I was applying for a job, luckily here at Tech. And then we got to be colleagues directly. So,
and then I became her mentor, and then we became collaborators.
Yes. So, it's all neat and tidy. As any grad students are listening, that's how easy it is. But actually, no. But actually, if we're thinking about the process, before we even talk about the content of the book, the idea of putting this book together, as far as I can understand, putting any book together, but particularly a co-edited volume, requires that you're working with someone.
Yes.
With someone who humanistically you agree with, you have similar values to. If what you're trying to do is something that isn't about pitting ideas against each other, but pulling something together, particularly, and Domino and I both realize that we sit kind of at the edges of this discipline. She from the literary side, and I in the cultural studies side, and I from the anthropological side, which is the study of folklore and folk practices, that has typically left studies of race and class to people of color, and have typically marginalized these discourses in the discipline, so much so that books like ours don't exist because scholars like us have not really been allowed to be part of the discipline in a big way. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that we would be able to come together, because for me, she was absolutely at the center of the discipline from my perspective being trained, even though she wasn't, I was reviewing her work, but I was like, oh, this clearly, when I read her book, this is clearly folklore. This is what folklore is now. And so I thought, why isn't more of this happening? And why didn't I take a course like this? And realize what we came to realize is that, there just wasn't enough material. Right. And anyone who was doing this kind of work kind of got soured on our discipline. Yes. And so just went their own way, right? Went into critical ethnic studies or went into media studies or was just doing something else. And so we thought, well, why don't we create a resource that our students, our graduate students, our advanced undergraduates, our peers could teach that was actually conspicuously saying, look at individual traditional practices, however you want to define them, and understand that we cannot in any way separate them out from both media representations and consumer culture, right? Even if that's a very unromantic way to think about how people understand their own traditions, there's no way that you can't do that and actually have a real conversation about race relations and class relations, particularly in the United States and more broadly in the hemispheric Americas. So I think that was really important.
And we certainly wanted to find an excuse to work together.
Yeah,
we genuinely like each other.
Yeah, no, we spent a lot of time together otherwise.
And we, certainly admire each other, and I'm a big fan of Rachel's work, and I think we both thought that we could bring something distinct to this project, and I think we found, not only that our expertise complemented, one complemented the other, but we were thinking in similar ways about how to frame these discussions. We knew we didn't want to have just conversations about stereotypes, and we didn't want to have conversations about authenticity, and we were trying to move conversations and disciplinary practices we wanted to map their movement in different ways. And so that very much influenced how we thought about the collection and the pieces that we selected for the collection. And the other thing I'll say about how this came to be is that, yes, we wanted to figure out a way to work together. But I had an idea, and one day we were supposed to be writing together, and I said, what if we put together a collection on, I don't know, something like race and cultural practice and popular culture or something like that? What would we call it? And Rachel looked at me and said, I don't know, race and cultural practice and popular culture.
Write it down. Just write it down for now.
Right. And so, she said, yeah, write that down. And so I wrote it down, and I said, well, let's come back to it. And we kept coming back to it.
And it still made sense, right? I think another aspect of pulling this together was that we weren't interested in being opaque. Mm-hmm. We weren't interested in creating a really boring book. I mean, part of what we wanted was to create a book that we felt proud to give to our students and say, this is some interesting stuff, but it's also really significant for your own research. But the idea that we had, we've been bombarded for years with kind of the same old thing, and we really wanted to do something different. In that way, I think theoretically too, we were really concerned, and Domino and I, see eye to eye on this, that when we think about the discourses within the text itself, it really doesn't privilege the same old folks or the same combination of folks. Mm-hmm. And that became really important, right? To think, what would it mean to have like a majority Native and Latino studies kind of folks, a smattering, maybe a little bit of African American, Asian American, critical white studies, right? To something just different, something that wasn't put together in the same way. Just because we thought, if I read this, I would then get a different sense of the possibilities for this topic. Mm-hmm. And so that became really important, this idea of what could this start, right? What kind of conversations could this start? And that could be, that we could really ethically and disciplinarily get behind, right? This is work that we very much want to continue to do. And so it made sense that we kind of did it in this way.
Well, and I'm glad it worked out. It sounds like I really can't think of another two people who are working together who sound like they work so well together as you two. Finishing each other's sentences and clearly in many ways being on the same wavelength. I'm curious, though, as you were starting to think about putting together this idea of a collection on race and cultural practice in popular culture, where were the areas that you automatically you both agreed, and where, if ever, were there tensions in how you would approach it or conceptually how you would do this?
I don't think there were any tensions. I know that sounds rather utopic, but
I think, and this is one of the things. I don't think there were places where there were tensions. I think I think Domino and I work very similarly, but very differently. Domino is definitely someone who's very good at organizing. I can't see from the level, like she has the bird's eye view. She's like, oh no, this goes here. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But I'm looking more at sort of the conversations within, and I could see connections, but I feel like in a lot of ways,
in the structure
of the book, we were able to, that's kind of almost where it was most difficult. On a lot of levels, we weren't having issues with things like what is a cultural text or what is cultural practice, right? And I think that's actually really important because part of what I think we both were kind of against in terms of the larger disciplinary frame is how tightly bounded scholars want to keep, what is and what is not folklore, because something about that definition is what maintains kind of this disciplinary uniqueness, whereas actually we're like, no, if you spread it out more, the impact is much greater, and to understand what, to see more crossovers. So I think attention-wise, I don't think so. But you know what? Honestly, I'm junior faculty. Doma's my mentor, senior faculty. It could have been very different if it could have been weird. But it wasn't. So we got lucky. But it also could have been weird if we were really, practically thinking of grad students in mind, right? Domino senior faculty, I'm junior faculty, which means we're not kind of working towards the same goals professionally. We're both looking to move forward. But if we were, let's say, both junior faculty trying to go for tenure the same year or year after each other, that would have meant, well, how do I put my stamp on this book differently? I think that's right. So Domino, again, as senior faculty, was very generous with me learning, like, okay, how does putting the books together even work? Mm-hmm. But understanding that this text for each of us could be narrated very differently and very productively for where we were in our careers.
That being said, I think early on we had and again, this speaks to my understated superpower in terms of organization and thinking about planning. We had a clear division of labor from the beginning. We collaborated on the CFP that went out. Rachel did the initial intake of the proposals that we received. We reviewed them together. We began to think about organizationally how this would take shape. Even in that early stage when we were sending out our responses to the proposals, we were already beginning to think about visualizing race, sounding race, the racialization in place that became the parts of the book. And so, I think if you're going to do an edited collection with someone else, because ours worked out very, very well, and I know others have not. And I think having a clear understanding of who's going to do what, a clear division of labor, and respect for the other person and the other person's times. That being said, in terms of, thinking about how we were going to organize the book, is that when we were writing our introduction, we leaned into our specialties. And Rachel is the trained folklorist. I'm the self-trained folklorist. Rachel works with popular culture. I've trained in popular culture. So if you're looking at the introduction, the first draft of the section, the folklore section, Rachel wrote that. The popular culture section, I wrote that. And then we switched, right? She revised my pop culture section, and then I revised her folklore section. And then we both kind of added our own dimension to both of those areas. So what you hear in that introduction is very much a combination of our voices and our ideas.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just sort of a back and forth. You do the folklore, I do the popular culture.
I think just to add to that, and that's a big part of it, right? The writing process. I mean, this is something that we wouldn't have done this, I believe, if we hadn't had a couple of years of good experience of just being able to sit at a table and write independently together. Because part of what we found was that we could sit at a table and then have a lot of good ideas kind of go back and forth between us. And we'd often say, oh, we should write that, save that. Well, we should write that later. We're like, oh yeah. But it also meant that there was a kind of a healthy relationship where it wasn't territorial. And like I said, Domino's specialties are specific. My specialties are specific, but we're able to sort of ask each other respectful questions like, as someone who's not a pop culture expert, like, I don't get that. What do I do with that? And that we could make it better for one another. We could make each other's work better without trying to replace the other's voice.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where some of the tension comes for a lot of people. Certain people want to be heard at a certain volume the whole time.
I think so.
And I think both of us were pretty good about wanting to share the spotlight for what we wanted, what we hoped to produce in the book.
And I would say that, if you're going to do a collaboration in an edited collection, I mean, you have to have a healthy ego. I mean, to think that you can put that together, but you also know when to check that.
Right. It was always the kind of realistic question for what are we doing? Because we get frustrated just with the process, right? Because the edited collection is a lot of real basic things like, how do you make sure that you're communicating in a structurally similar way with everyone? Is everyone emailing the right generic email address with Google that has, are we keeping up with our collaborators, but are they actually following through? And I think that's where it would get frustrating. It's like, wait, where is the file with this person's CV and photo or whatever? And those are the little bits that required us to kind of like pause and not kill ourselves because people, weren't responding to their emails promptly or they weren't reading things completely.
Right.
And so those are the areas. It was the logistics. It was really trying to make sure people were very excited about the volume. People were, the idea that people really wanted to be a part of it. And one of the things that we really got were some really amazing senior faculty, but also saying, we want folks that are being trained now.
Yeah.
We want folks that are just coming out of their degrees. It wasn't enough to say to have people that were already established looking back, but what are people who have been trained in the last 5 years and who are making their careers now? What do they think, right? Because we were kind of thinking, again, not
what trying conversations that they're having.
Right? Yeah. Well, it didn't have to be the same old thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it really was those logistics that made us kind of want to be like, we're never doing this again. And it was like, we could totally do that again.
Yeah. And now we're like, what else can we do?
Yeah, what else can we do? Like, will they let us do it again? We're here like systemically, are they going to let us do it again?
Yeah, well, let me ask you then about contributors, finding people. I think one of the interesting things that this highlights, so with your book, but also in the bigger picture sort of academic realm, earlier on, especially, it was very hard to find people of color writing and having their voices heard in academic presses and in collections and these kinds of things. Now it seems to be a little bit better, or there seems to be a little bit more options, but I've heard also, especially from people of color, that they suddenly become the representative. So if anybody is doing anything on, let's say, African American representation, they have to keep answering emails. They have to do these things that basically white faculty don't have to do because they're not asked to represent their culture all of the time. And so in one way, you want to give voices as much as possible. In another way, though, it seems like it can be a very big burden, especially if you're on a tenure track clock or something like that. How do you, either personally or with a more general consideration for academics, think about how it is working and how it might work better in terms of having a number of voices heard, but not putting the burden on people of color in particular to sort of always be representing their ethnic groups?
Well, that unfortunately is the reality of the place of marginalized faculty in the academy. I mean, you talk about what you're talking about is the invisible labor, or the person of color tax, or the underrepresented faculty member tax, so to speak. And by tax, I mean doing that labor, that invisible labor that your Anglo counterparts, your cisgender heterosexual counterparts don't have to do.
No.
And so, that kind of labor involves everything from undergraduates in the classroom all the way to mentorship. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate to have such a wonderful mentee with Rachel, but my decision to take on that labor had everything to do with the fact that I didn't have someone like me be available. I didn't have anybody necessarily to help me demystify the process of the academy as an assistant professor and even as an associate professor. I mean, I don't necessarily have a formal mentor now as I try to make my way through the ranks to become a full professor. I could definitely use a mentor now, but the reality is that there are not enough faculty of color, for me, Latino faculty, Latina faculty, in the senior ranks at the University of Texas, despite the fact that Latinos make up 40% of the population of the state. We're some of the most underrepresented faculty at the university. That's the reality. And that reality, I think, can have a direct impact on how one navigates the university, I think, at large.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was thinking when Domino was talking, I was sort of listening that, again, our relationship could have been very different. And she could have, Domino was a different person, right? She wasn't as a thoughtful mentor. I could have really become an assistant, like laborer on this case, on this book, right? But the whole way through, Domino was very clear. You have to get your monograph done. This does not replace your monograph, right? We're doing this because we want to build your profile and we want to build our network and we want to build this conversation. Right. But she was very clear in understanding that we're doing this, but at the same time, this isn't replacing your single author work because you have to get tenure still, right? So the idea that Domino very well could have, if she was, had more, had a different kind of sense of how she was going to move through her own job ranks, she could have easily made this about a second book for her moving forward only, right? But the fact that it was very much about making sure that, again, the demystifying the academic process was saying, look, publications are not all equal, right? So understanding what an edited collection does at the senior level versus at a junior level is still very clear. But also, I think we put a lot of thought into where we wanted this book to get published from. Knowing perfectly well, so knowing that the handful of junior colleagues that are, in this book, right? The idea that we weren't going to publish someplace where this wasn't going to have traction for their career. Right. So we picked, a top-ranked university press. This wasn't going to be a second or third-rate press just to get it out.
Right.
It was going to have to be curated in a very particular way that we could ethically say, we want you on board, and this is something that you can put on your CV, and this is something that can help move your career forward. Right. And not just get your voice out, not just, move things forward, not publication for publication's sake, but the idea that this was going to have some teeth to it in terms of moving through, bigger disciplines or conference settings, right? So we chose Rutgers with that in mind.
And I should say that even before we had a collection even sketched out, we shopped around the idea for the collection to several different presses.
Yeah.
And in what was really an unprecedented sort of move, every single one of them expressed interest in the book.
Yeah. Before anything.
And literally replied the same day. And I had to tell Rachel, okay, so just so you know, this is in no way usual. This is not normal. This is not how this works.
Yeah.
Certainly how it didn't work this way for my book.
Right.
And she hadn't yet she didn't have her book crunch yet. And so I was trying to tell her, so this is very unusual. This is this is out of the ordinary. But I think that because we had so many presses vying for the book, this told us that there was a need, an absolute need.
Right.
And as Rachel mentioned, we were very conscious about the decision to include senior faculty. And we're so lucky to have Gerald Visner included in the collection. But then, to also have graduate students who have since graduated
and gone on to tenure track
jobs. I mean, that's been very exciting as well.
Yeah.
So I think having those voices included in the conversation at all ranks was very exciting.
Mm-hmm. When you say that this is something that was needed and that you felt wasn't quite available yet, which is one of the things that inspired you, can you say a little bit, maybe give a few details about what it was that you realized was working, like with this idea? Because I think people could say that, there's lots of stuff written on race and there's lots of stuff written on cultural practice and pop culture. But what was it when you were thinking about it, envisioning it, and then when you were getting the chapter submissions in that really made you think like, this is standing out for a reason I anticipated and something that's different than what we've seen before?
I think one thing, and this is seen specifically in text. So one, thinking particularly with folklore and popular culture, kind of two valences in the same discipline that tend to overlap, but theoretically aren't supposed to overlap, at least from the discipline's angle. We found that authorship, there was one book that had come out in maybe 5 years prior to ours. And to be perfectly honest, it was edited by a white professor and a white graduate student. And every single author in that book was North American white, Anglo, and there was one woman. And so just the idea, and they were all trained for the same plays, and we were just like, what? Like, can you actually publish a book now that has no people of color and claim to be talking about like the variations of theories of what could be considered folklore? I'm like, you're clearly not going to get any kind of diversity in thought, right? Not even just thinking about, because you can have authors that are really digging into different topics, but these were not. These weren't people that were trained in critical ethnic studies or anthropology or other places. They were all kind of focused on the same core of North American or American, quote unquote, folklore. And it was really disappointing on a lot of levels, because we realized we opened this book and we're like, I want to read this. This doesn't say anything. This doesn't make any tie to the kind of research that we're doing, the kind of research our graduate students are doing, or to the kind of questions that we keep poking at every time we see some kind of issue of representation in popular media, right? And so we thought, well, what do we give to students? We can't, the politics of assigning your own stuff can only go so far. But even thinking there's got to be other people out there. So we thought, for sure, we just needed to pivot and ask. I think we realized, like, again, these folks were just looking in their own circle. So we decided, okay, how do we expand that conversation to other circles, right? And so that's, I think, on some level, what we were thinking about in terms of just gaps, right? The gaps in research, the gaps in authorship. And a lot of times people claim, oh, well, there isn't anyone who does this work. I'm like, I get 5 people that you could talk to, right? But you don't know them, and you think their work is ethnic studies, so you don't. And so part of this is about thinking outside of disciplinary boundaries, right? Getting a little bit promiscuous disciplinarily and saying, you know what? There are a lot of folks working on this very topic, but they don't get to be a part because you claim them to be, someone else. So I think that disciplinary identity and authorship was something that we took very, very seriously.
And the other thing I will say is that, so going back to your question about, and if I understand your question correctly, this idea that there are lots of folk out there talking about race and popular culture and what makes this collection so different. I think for us, what we wanted to do is we wanted to break down the silos in which people talk about specific representations of race or the way in which they're thinking about race critically. And again, I mentioned early on, we wanted to move beyond conversations of stereotypes and conversations of authenticity and just questions around representation. I think what made our approach different, and to this I attribute to Rachel, is this idea of what does embodied practice look like visually in popular culture, in music? Like, how do we talk about embodied practice? How do we talk about folklore in popular culture and all the valences of folklore, not just folklore, but the folkloristics?
Yeah.
Right? How do we discuss this? And what does this do to conversations about race and representation that move the conversations in new and interesting ways away from the kind of same old.
Yeah, we just get tired of, everyone's rehashing the same conversations. And I think that's why it was so important, really, when the book was being reviewed, and then when we had scholars, talking about the book, the blurbs, other things. They weren't just Latino. They were Latino scholars, they were Native scholars, right? The idea that this book for us, it didn't need to be vetted by, let's say, a white cis heterosexual scholar at a particular university that would give it credence. We thought, these conversations have legs regardless, right? And the people that we want to speak to, right, is this community of scholars doing this work, but who do it sort of subsumed in their own disciplines kind of alone, right? And to say, what would it mean if we all kind of came together and had this conversation? Right. How productive could that be? Right?
Mm-hmm.
We were so lucky that Professor Aldama agreed to write the foreword for the collection because, on the one hand, yes, he's this amazing scholar in Latino studies, but period, he's an amazing scholar who works with folklore, who does comic book studies, film.
Yeah.
He's so prolific and so influential across disciplines.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, he was the perfect person in every way. He was the perfect person. And not simply because he's a Latino studies scholar.
And that's actually, I think, really important, the fact that you have two scholars of Latino studies, anthropology, English, both folklore, right, producing a book that is not simply meant for those departments or disciplines, right? And I think that's something, and that was also, if we're thinking again about grad students, that's kind of a risk, right? If you're a junior faculty person saying, I'm not necessarily creating something that speaks only to a smaller body that someone can vet and say I deserve tenure for, right? To say, I'm going to take a risk and say, what about these other people, these other conversations, these other scholars? Because on some level, we're thinking about this bigger picture, right? Of both contributing to the discipline, contributing to a process of mentorship really that leaves the university, right? Because Domino and I working together is great and it builds something here at Texas. But then again, putting out sort of our feelers, having this connection with folks at Cal State LA, at the University of Georgia, in Oregon, right? In other parts of the country, Indiana and Providence, right? All of these places then build a new network for folks who might be at smaller places that don't have the same connections to then when Domino becomes full, or God help me if I become full, right? We become people that become part of their mentorship cycle too, and say, when I was my first year on the tenure track, I published with, Domino Perez. Maybe she'll write a letter for me now that I'm going up 7 years later for tenure, right? So all of this is really, as much as it's about pushing very particular theoretical tenets to the surface, right? Getting people to talk about these really important issues, because these issues will be there, right? And they'll keep changing, and we aren't pretending that this is a book is, we captured the moment, but we understand that it's going. But what's really alive about this process, again, are these networks that we're building, right? And networks that say, there is a steady conversation, but also network of peer support, right? That becomes possible with these kinds of publications.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really important consideration that is something I'm more and more interested in, is how do you stay sort of rigorous and continue in maybe a very niche discipline, but also work to engage with people who are outside of that. Well, one thing I've noticed actually is that, this book in particular, I think could be assigned in an undergraduate class, could be assigned in a graduate class, but would have potentially quite different implications, I guess, in terms of teaching, because I think in an undergraduate class, you would approach the content of this in a different way than an advanced graduate studies work. How do you do that yourselves, and how do you think about that? Like, I'm just thinking, for example, I teach Intro to Media. It's a freshman class sometimes. And so the conversations we have about race, for starters, in rural Georgia, but also the conversations just for people who haven't been to university and haven't read a lot of critical race studies, will be very, very different than somebody who's about to get a PhD perhaps in something related to critical race studies. And yet you want to try to engage as many people as possible. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about how you might approach the conversations or the content in this book if you were talking to someone, that freshman who hasn't been to a university versus somebody who's much more advanced. Do you try to have a similar conversation, or do they look very different? I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
So I can speak to it in terms of my teaching, and I think I can bring it back around to the book. In terms of undergraduates, I find that even in Texas, undergraduates are terrified to talk about the R word, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They're terrified to be wrong. They don't want to be perceived as racist. They don't want to say the wrong things, and that's no way to move a conversation forward. That's not even a way to have a conversation, right? It's already shut down. It's already silenced. So what I think a book like this can do, especially with Professor Aldama's forward, and even with our own introduction, is if this book can help, I think, undergraduates understand what are some of the conversations that are taking place about race. In other words, talking about race doesn't necessarily just mean you're a racist and I'm not. Absolutely. Right? Or this is racist and this not. It's not a how-to manual, but how do we talk about race thoughtfully? How do we talk about race critically? And what does that kind of thoughtful, critical discussion about race do? And what other conversations can be generated from that foundation? And that's something that I do in all of my classes. You talk about teaching media studies. I regularly teach a course on YA, fiction and film. And a big part of what we talk about in that young adult fiction class is about race, is about representation. But again, I'm not interested in talking about stereotypes. I'm interested in talking about, right, how does race get embodied in these texts and what does it do in the text? And those kinds of conversations I find allow students to feel like they can participate a little bit more freely, because it's not about who's doing race well and who's doing race not so well, and who's a racist and who's not a racist. It reframes the conversation. And I think that's hugely important for undergraduates. And I try to really do that in all the classes that I teach. I teach a big 250-person American literature survey, and we do that in that class as well. I try to give them the language to engage with issues surrounding race and cultural practice in a way that allows them to feel empowered. But I also try to encourage them to be wrong, right? It's okay to be wrong. But when you're wrong, I'm going to push back on it. And you're going to have to be okay with that, because that's called learning.
Yeah.
And you have to be open to that. And, we have to resist the urge to be in this place of a call out culture where someone's trying to talk through something and gets it wrong, but at least, she's thinking about it out loud, and we need to engage her where she is. And we all need to think through it. And so I think that, trying to make an inclusive environment, an open environment, and help students think about how to talk about race in new ways. I think, again, that's key to who I am as a teacher. But I think that's also what we tried to do in the introduction.
Yeah, I was going to say, just thinking, hearing Domino talk, giving us some ideas. And
because that's how we do it.
Yeah. I have nothing to say. Oh, no, I do. I guess this could even be because I teach sort of small seminars in Latino studies, so I have advanced undergraduates, and then I teach graduate students. But I was thinking something that my students would specifically, a conversation that could be had in either one of those kinds of places, maybe not in 101 kind of level. But the idea of having scholars of color or scholars from a community talking about their community, but not talking about it in terms of themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you have a Cherokee scholar talking about Cherokee masculinity, but this isn't about her? Right? And I think that's something that students are still learning. Even the ones who are in master's and PhD programs, they think that if they're talking about quote unquote their own community, that it really is just all about them. And you're like, well, not quite. This is just a position, that a different positionality you have with relation to your topic. And so I think this gives us a really good, a good sort of example of, I'm thinking of Jose Anguiano's piece on voicing the occult and thinking about a Cholo Goth aesthetic, right? I know him personally, and I know he is very into these different music scenes, but this isn't about his life and how he is not a Cholo goth, right? But the idea that it's something beyond that, and that he understands his perspective as a sound studies scholar, as a Chicano studies scholar, as a historian, that allows him to sort of instrumentalize his ethnic racial understanding and his growing up in LA into understanding this subculture differently than someone else. And I think that is a really good model to this group.
But fundamentally, I think, if we even just take 10 steps back from this, what I think this collection does for both undergraduates and graduate students is that, and I know this is going to sound strange, but I still encounter this almost every single day or, in the classroom, is that it shows students that they have the permission to talk about these things. Right? Because a lot of them tell me, graduate students and undergraduates, I didn't know we could talk about these things.
Yeah.
I didn't know that anybody would be interested in hearing us talk about this. Wait, what? We can talk about Chicano goth?
Yeah.
Like, what is that? Oh, yeah. That's a super niche, right?
Yeah.
Wait, we can be two graduate students, two Latino graduate students talking about white femininity. Like, really? We can do that? And just that sense of access, that sense of ownership, that sense of exploration, and intellectual, achievement and like what is possible. The book lays bare, you can talk about all of these things and more. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, and I like that. And it's always a sort of magic moment when you see people open up and realize that something they thought was not allowed in education or in the university is actually very welcome. At the same time, though, I think the stereotype of pop culture studies or people who do work in pop culture is that they're simply just talking about stuff they like, which is not, hopefully, usually not the case, especially at in a sort of rigorous conference or paper or like in your book. But I'm wondering also if you experience people then thinking like, okay, well, I want to talk about this stuff I like. How do you push it into, other than just showing them chapters, like you said, how do you push them into, I guess, thinking a little bit more rigorously? And in other words, if you were introducing these concepts to somebody who hasn't read the book, isn't necessarily familiar with the discipline, how do you know the difference between someone sort of talking about a show they like or a film they like versus somebody who's sort of engaging it intellectually as part of maybe folklore studies or cultural studies?
The critical frame. Right, the critical frame. And I think one of the helping students pull together projects, right, that forces them to look at either piece of pop culture or mass culture in connection with theoretical research and interview style. I ask them about state. Like, why does this conversation matter?
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're like, well, they haven't thought about that just because you just watch the show every Thursday and you're super psyched. And like, I'm all for that.
Right.
But have you watched that 6 minutes you're talking about 400 times to try to figure out the timing of this racist joke or the context of, and they're like, oh,
it's edited.
And so this idea, so like, do you understand this idea of context in a really critical way? But really, I start with that question of stakes. Like, I said, well, what if I don't like the show? Why should I care about what you're saying? And they're like, and so for me, that's the starting point. Can they understand that it's more than entertainment?
Right.
Which is always a concept applied to folklore at the undergraduate level. Like, this is more than entertainment. It's more than just a joke. But the same thing with television and media studies broadly and film studies is like, this is more than just what captivates an audience. It's something much deeper that you have to go there.
Right. And it's, it's not just about, oh my gosh, I really like this show. And, I had a similar conversation with my graduate students this week about Game of Thrones. Yeah. Right. We were all sort of having, during our break, we were having this sort of geeked out fan moment about Game of Thrones. And they were talking about it in terms of its content. And then I started bringing up some of the formal aspects of it. And that completely shifted the conversation and their level of engagement. And I used that as a jumping off point to get us back into our discussion that we were having regarding the text that day. And I bring that point up because I think that a lot of times, especially with undergraduates and some graduate students too, they don't necessarily understand the formal aspects of the popular culture with which they want to engage. Literally how it's made. And, beyond the materiality, but like, what are the conventions? And then you get into conversations about genre. You get into conversations about access. You get into conversations about history. I think that a lot of times, when people to hear that you do popular culture studies, they say, oh, you sit around and you watch movies. if it were that easy, it kind of but, I think Rachel's right. Have you watched that one awful film 10,000 times? So, it's like haunting your nightmares and you can recite it line by line, right? That's the level of engagement that it needs to take place. It can't be cursory. It can't be on the surface. And so how teaching students at all levels, how do we begin to engage critically with this? What are the questions we want to bring to bear on the text? What is a critical frame that can help bring those critical issues to light? I mean, are we looking at a queer studies frame? Are we looking at folklore? What's the difference between folklore and folkloristics, right? What's the difference between cultural studies and cultural practice, right? What's the difference between popular culture and film studies? I mean, as someone who has a film studies background, that's a big deal. That matters.
Right. I think too, understanding I teach folklore classes and cultural studies classes in Latino studies, but I know when to say, I think you need to take a production class or a media history class in radio, television, film.
Right.
Like reminding students, this class is lit. There's a whole body of scholarship around this disciplinary framing that would be really helpful if this is what you want to do later. And they're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is being willing to open up that kind of discourse. And part of that, again, comes back to being disciplinarily confident, right? In the sense that you're willing to understand that crossing those boundaries is okay, right? I have a place in folklore and anthropology, but really you need to be in Dr. Perez's, YA film class because that's where you're going to understand this best, right? Mm-hmm. So I think part of it is showing students all the possibility that can come and the kind of conversations that they can.
And not to mention to that, I would add to know what your limitations are.
Absolutely.
Right? And say, you know what, I can help you take this project this far, but I have this great colleague.
Yeah. We can take you the rest of the way.
Who can take you, a good leg of the journey, and then she might
find someone else
for you, right? But I think that it's knowing who those networks are and cultivating those networks, which brings us right back to the book, right? I think what we have here is we have an amazing network of scholars who are talking about race and cultural practice across lines of culture, across lines of community, across lines of racial and ethnic identification. And this book represents a community of scholars that are, I think, forging new conversations and new territories in ways that I think are absolutely key in some of these disciplines that tend to be rather conservative.
Absolutely. But I think one of the things that was really at the beginning of our conversation with why the book is so important, or the book is so important in the way that we wanted to construct it, was that to say that you can talk about race only amongst Latino scholars, or only amongst Asian American scholars, or only amongst Native scholars, or only amongst Black scholars, right? The idea that we said, it can't be bound like that.
Or that whiteness isn't racialized.
Right. So the idea that you kind of were like, you gotta shake it up. We gotta kind of be having we gotta show people that these conversations are happening all at the same time. We really need to be talking to one another, right? To really have sort of this bigger picture understanding of race as a production, essentially of our social lives.
I mean, those are some excellent and really crucial points. I like how you've put that. I want to ask you about something that you've said already a couple times, which is that you're not necessarily interested in simply pointing out stereotypes. I think I know what you mean, and I think I agree very much with that, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate. Like, it's tempting, especially in an early level class or something, to simply point out stereotypes, or to think that that's all you need to do. And you've already elaborated on the kinds of nuances that are required for sort of really rigorous study in cultural practice. But why isn't simply pointing out stereotypes something that interests you or something that you think needs to be done?
I think on one level that students, this idea of popular culture as a place of potential, right, where students see their social lives played out or played back to them, right? There's this relationship that's built. I think that with the stereotypes are kind of the low-hanging fruit.
It is, because it reduces the conversation a lot of times to this is a wrong kind of representation, suggesting that there is essentially out there some kind of right representation. And I think that, the conversation to say, okay, how does racialization take place? In other words, how does brownness become legible on the screen outside of stereotypes? And so you have something like ugly brown bodies, right? Which takes the conversation away from, okay, machete represents this particular kind of cultural stereotype to looking and seeing like, okay, how is the brown body written in film? Is it written through dialect? Is it written through aesthetic? Is it written through, the way in which the organization of the frame? Is it written through music? Is it written through all of those things, right? In other words, taking the conversation outside or away from stereotypes shifts the conversation about race in other directions. I think that can be more, in some cases, more generative to talk about what's quote unquote actually happening with this character or with this cultural group on screen.
Yeah. And so in this book in particular, you talk about racializing place, you talk about sound, you talk about embodiment, you talk about visualizing race. But you can never talk about everything. I mean, there's always much more to be said. And I know that that's an obvious statement from anyone working in academia. I'm wondering though, if there are any topics or issues that you specifically sort of wanted to, but couldn't get to for whatever reason in this book.
Yes and no. I mean, yes, because I'm sure there's something out there we would have liked to include. Yeah. We just didn't necessarily see it. It's strange when I say that even at that early stage when we were receiving proposals, the form of the book, the structure of the book was already taking place. We really did have a group that were focusing on, the visualization of race, what race sounded like, racialization. And so these chapters fell into very easy categories. Yeah. We didn't necessarily have any apertures where we're like, what are we going to do with this one? Yeah. It doesn't quite fit. But it's good. But it's good.
Yeah, no, I would say that, I feel like the better question for us would be if we wanted to do another project. Yeah. How would we focus it? And maybe we would have a more singular theoretical focus, like we would take queer theory or queer studies through this idea of understanding race in conversation and have it be a little more specific, something like that. But I feel, I don't necessarily have any places where I thought we wish we'd gone or we hadn't. Yeah.
Well, no, that's good. I mean, I didn't mean to imply that you were missing anything because it does cover so much ground. In general, I mean, you said earlier that you put this together, you had the idea to put this together, and then you did, and editors were excited, particularly because it was doing something that hadn't been done, therefore breaking new ground in a sense. Where else are places that you would like to see that happen? If not in your own work, then through other people doing somewhat similar work. Where else is there a sort of lack in terms of the scholarship? Even if there's maybe a little bit being done, what would you like to see more of right now?
Everything.
Like, what on race? All of it. Race and class. All of it, right? I think class becomes an interesting valence to use because so many times our students, at least, I feel like I get a lot of good ideas teaching because you realize that students just haven't heard. I'm like, oh, you don't know that? Oh, we should talk about that more. Someone should write about that in a way that's legible to you. But I really think understanding socioeconomic class and, again, how that fits into these different both representational images, right, with media, or even thinking about something of, the cost of a movie ticket, how expensive it is to go. And the idea of, we think like, oh, everyone's exposed, but if you don't have cable, you don't have Netflix, right? We're not even having a conversation with you. So a little more of an interpretation of class.
But there's that current that runs through the collection and engages with class. I think certainly in Red Land, White Power, Blue Sky, and the Bridge. Absolutely. But also Romero's piece, the Performing Cherokee Masculinity. I mean, there is that undercurrent, or even in 1,000 Lines of Flight.
Yeah, I mean, so really, like, the idea that...
If you're talking about incarcerated communities...
Yeah, you're talking about class, right? And I think that's the connection we'll see more of, right? Like, people being okay with directly addressing these issues. Yeah. Right? Saying, that to talk about this and to really acknowledge, to not talk about race and class is kind of subpar scholarship. If you're not bringing in these conversations that are obviously there, right, or at least noting that you're leaving them out, right, that's incomplete. And I think that's something that we want to sort of develop further.
Well, because also I think if you don't address them, you're promoting this fantasy of racial
utopia.
Yeah, absolutely, right? This imagined racial community that isn't diverse within itself in terms of class and sexuality and gender presentation.
I think that actually becomes really important because the nuance of understanding race, not just across racial groups, or again with the sort of stereotypical like white versus not white, essentially. But to understand the nuances of race and class performance among Mexican Americans or among Filipino Americans or African Americans, right? Those become really important, right? And so thinking about, like Quincy Martinez Rivera's piece talking about indigenous popular culture, right? That whole thing is a conversation about race and class in changing indigenous populations in Mexico, right? So it has something kind of broad thinking about popular culture and popular music, but that's all about class mobility, right? But it's almost class mobility that is very particular to their context, right? So I think that's the kind of conversation that really, it's not to scratch the surface and say this, like you said, low-hanging fruit, the things that are easy, but the things that are hard are really digging deep into these entrenched conversations that are often silenced within racial communities.
And the other thing I would say to that is that these cultural productions are not happening in isolation, right? To say that there are, that American Indian popular culture is not influenced by mainstream popular culture more broadly is absurd, right? And I think that, that's what I really love of Anguiano's piece is, the engagement with the Pet Shop Boys and the reimagining of that is like Chicano God, right? You have to have that Pet Shop Boys text to have that transformation, right? They're equally influenced by British New Wave, pop culture. Chicano God culture is not, it didn't spontaneously just emerge out of nothing. It's in conversation with something else, with larger traditions. And I think that's so important.
Right. I think because it takes away some of that exoticness.
Absolutely.
Right?
Or the idea of an authenticity.
Right.
There is singular.
Right. The singular line of development. The idea that people are not living these linear lives.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, and there is so much to talk about, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me today. So I don't want to keep you too long. One of my last questions though is, it sounds like you've really thought about this, and so I'm curious what advice you might have for maybe early scholars, graduate students, newly hired assistant professors or instructors, when people like yourselves are in early stages thinking about how to engage these various communities. Because in one sense, it can feel like you're stuck in an ivory tower where you're very far away from a sort of everyday culture of the people. And in other ways, I guess you still need to like you've mentioned, publish ideally a monograph in a big press or something like that. And so there are a lot of constraints and there are a lot of issues in academia today. But if people are interested in engaging in a number of communities, but also want to do it strategically, do you have any advice for them?
Well, I think my first piece of advice is find a mentor.
Yes, find a mentor. Find a few mentors.
Yeah.
So you're getting a good sense of what the possibilities are for engaging with a scholar if you don't know them already.
Understand your relationality.
Yeah. And then understand
that community.
Yeah.
Right.
Understand and protecting your time.
Yeah.
Right. Understanding like you can absolutely be part of multiple communities. You still have to sleep. Or you still have to eat, right? So, really, and people have to, this is wonderful, right? People have to be very cautious about how they divvy out their time in the first 5 years, right? Because those are really crucial years. And as much as, you still have to get those really basic requirements that you're not going to get like a gold star for having all these connections but no publications. So I think being really realistic, but I think that's sort of a bigger question of, whether you really want to be in the academy.
Yeah.
So I think it's after the first full year or so that you can decide whether the way in which this place operates is completely antithetical to how you want to live your life.
Yeah.
So I think that's a bigger part. But absolutely find a good mentor, find 3 people who will talk to you and listen to you, and then figure out the kind of person who you want to build the longer term relationship with. And for what, right? Some people, Domino's an excellent mentor kind of holistically. She can do it all. But some people can maybe offer you advice on publications. Some people can tell you work-life balance is an unrealistic goal, right? Some people can have certain kinds of conversations. So I think if from a junior faculty position to understand, to establish these support networks as best you can, or to understand when you need to go outside of the university for those support.
Mm-hmm. Also, I think understanding that you're going to need to be able to narrate the legibility of your work.
Yes.
And by that, I mean, if you're working with multiple communities, if you're working with popular text, if you're working with folklore, and your research profile is reflective of these diverse interests, at some point you're going to have to narrate how all of these things fit together. And I think that as a junior scholar or even a scholar who's doing this kind of multimodal work, I think you have to understand for yourself how these things are connected before you can even begin to narrate them for somebody else. And at some point, you will have to narrate them for somebody else.
That's great advice, and I think really important. I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts about protecting your time. I think that's a phrase I've heard perhaps more recently, and it seems like something that it seems kind of obvious, and it seems like, yeah, of course we should protect our time, but I don't think a lot of us are very good at it or know how to do that. Have you found any ways that work in terms of making decisions? Like, should I focus on one thing or another? Is there any best way to protect your time, do you think?
Going back to the invisible labor of certain groups of individuals on this, and think about the tax on those particular individuals. I'm not going to lie, it's really hard to say no to students, especially when you have a strong point of identification with those students. And the fact that some of these students need a very different kind of mentoring, and knowing that if you don't do it, then that student is going to continue to be at a disadvantage. And I mean things like what to wear to an interview, how to talk about your own work in an interview, how to do a CV. I mean, the things that other people take for granted. So there is an additional dimension of labor that we take on, in part by choice, but it takes its toll. And so I think that, because there's even in this day and age, there are so few diverse faculty in higher ed that we get called upon repeatedly to be that person on the committee, whatever that committee is, right? Because people can point to us and be like, oh, look, there's representation. Look, we have a diverse committee. But at some point, I think we have to ask ourselves, what do we actually bring to these projects, right? These committee appointments. Are we just there to fill out to round out the diversity, or are we doing work that's meaningful? And if we're doing this other committee kind of service work, is that taking away from the meaningful work that we do? And so in that way, I think we need to learn to be more selective about what we say yes to. I know people say, oh, we need to say no to more things, but I think it's more than just saying no. I think it's about being selective to those things that we consent to. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and I really appreciate that. I have taken up a lot of your time, and I want to just say that it's exciting to see this kind of work happening and to be able to talk to the two of you about it. And I recommend to anyone who hasn't read this book yet to pick up Race and Cultural Practice in Popular Culture. It's a great example of a lot of the things that you've been talking about today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you both.
Thank you. We enjoyed speaking with you. Yes, absolutely.
As always, thank you very much for listening to and supporting tinap.org in whatever way you can. It's always a pleasure to be speaking to amazing writers as well as really invested and engaged scholars and academics, whether you're an early student or a full professor. It's great to keep that kind of conversation going through this podcast. There's going to be 2 more podcasts out this year in 2019, and then there are going to be a whole bunch of really cool interviews in the next year, and I hope you will join me for them. Again, thank you. I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.